Barbara Lee has committed her life to investing in revolutionary change by helping women become political leaders and powerful participants in democracy. She created the Barbara Lee Family Foundation, which is based in Cambridge, and supports innovative projects to help women gain and use their political power. She's known in the Boston area as a devoted advocate for the city's cultural life and the arts community. Barbara, you are truly a revolutionary woman yourself, and we're honored to have you moderate tonight's program. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very fun to be here along with all the other fans of Cokie Roberts and Women in History. I am very pleased to be here today. I have always been fascinated by women's history, and each day as I seek to engage women and empower women in the democratic process, I am inspired and comforted by the stories of women who have gone before us. It's their stories that sustain me as I work to help women make history. My love of women's history began with my grandmother, Minnie Greenberg. She told me many stories about what it was like growing up at the beginning of the 20th century. And I can remember particularly how vividly she described standing on a street corner in New York City and watching the suffragists march up Fifth Avenue. She inspired me to look at our past in order to see what our future could hold. Unfortunately, until recently, history books did not adequately acknowledge the significance of women's contributions. And so most of us were never told the stories of our founding mothers or of the many other women who have helped to build our nation. And thankfully, that is changing. Here in Boston, a group of public school teachers led the charge to make history and women's history more than just an afterthought. In 1989, they created the Boston Women's Heritage Trail. This series of walks around Boston highlight the contributions of women to our great Commonwealth. And how appropriate it is that we are gathered tonight in Old South Meeting House. This beautiful building has a colorful past. Some of you may know that it was the site of mass protests during the American Revolution. But do you also know that 100 years after those protest meetings, in the late 1800s, Old South was slated for demolition? And sure enough, it was a group of women who had the foresight to purchase and restore this historic building. And it marked the beginning of the historic preservation movement. This is just one of the stories that you will hear when you go walking on the Boston Women's Heritage Trail. The newest addition to the trail is the Boston Women's Memorial on Commonwealth Avenue between Fairfield and Gloucester Streets. And if you haven't gone to see it, you really need to do that. It brings to life the contributions of Abigail Adams, Phyllis Wheatley, and Lucy Stone. Each of these women had progressive ideas that were ahead of her time, and each was committed to social change. Thanks to civic projects like these, and to authors like Cokie Roberts, we are bringing women's history into our homes and into our classrooms, and giving women the credit and the thanks that they deserve. So tonight I have the honor of welcoming Cokie Roberts to this podium. Throughout her career, Cokie has done so much to illuminate the important stories of women. A trailblazer in her own right, she has been chronicling the lives of Americans for many years in her dual roles as political analyst and reporter at NPR and at ABC News. Been there too, she said. In addition to her broadcasting career, Cokie and her husband Stephen Roberts co-author a weekly syndicated column. And together they wrote a book called From This Day Forward, which reflects upon their life together and on the institution of marriage, American style. In this book, and in her New York Times bestseller, We Are Our Mother's Daughters, Cokie uses personal stories and memories as a springboard for discussing larger issues, including the role of women in society. Tonight, as you heard, Cokie is here to talk with us about her most recent book, Founding Mothers. It is an intimate and illuminating look at the fervently patriotic and passionate women who were founding mothers. Their contributions proved just as important to the forging of our new nation as the rebellion that established it. So please welcome to the podium Cokie Roberts.
Thank you, Barbara. I must say it's a little odd for a good Catholic girl like me to be on the altar of a Puritan meeting house, but I'll get over it. It's lovely to be with all of you tonight. I am thrilled to be able to talk about these women in their hometown, many of them. But I must say I can never come to Boston without thinking of a much more recent politician, my dear old friend Tip O'Neill. And Tip O'Neill, in the few weeks before he died, Steve and I went to a charity event that he was at, and we didn't want to go. It was, out in outer darkness, Virginia someplace. And we said we really ought to go because who knows if we'll ever see him again. And sure enough, we didn't. And he told at that event a joke which has become my joke. And I mean my joke. I have one. And people tell me jokes all the time. I think that's great. I'm going to remember that. Gone. But Tip's joke has always stayed with me. It is one that starts the way so many do, which is, a guy dies, gets to heaven, goes to the pearly gates, St. Peter greets him. And he says, "You, my son, have been a good son of Holy Mother Church. You get a wish." And the guy says, "I do? I get a wish? Great." He says, "Yes, I would like to meet the Virgin Mary." St. Peter says, "Easy, done." So in he goes, he meets Mary, and she says, "I understand you've always wanted to meet me." He says, "Yes, there's a question I've always wanted to know the answer to." He says, "Over all those centuries, in all that art, in all those stained glass windows, in all those paintings, in all those sculptures, any time you're holding the baby Jesus, you look sad. Why?" She says, "I wanted a girl." Well, you can see why I've remembered it, but I promise you, you will never be able to look at a Madonna and child again. Your trips to Italy are ruined, except for all the good food. I actually spent a lot of time looking at Madonnas and children in recent years because my mother, after 17 years in Congress, retired and then discovered that was very hard work. So she accepted at the age of 81 the job of United States Ambassador to the Vatican. It's a new country, she was old, all of that. But she thought it would be an intellectually interesting capstone to a long political career. She followed your mayor, and we just left that like there. And it was a very interesting job, except what happened in this country happened, and she found herself representing Bill Clinton to the Pope. Well, if anybody could do this, my mother could, but it was extremely difficult, and I'm happy to say she is now safely home on Bourbon Street, which is where she lives. And I'm not kidding, right smack dab in the middle of all of the honky-tonk on Bourbon Street. When the children were small, I used to walk by, the strippers and the other neighbors and say, through the woods and over the hills to grandmother's house we go. And then when she moved from Bourbon Street to the Vatican, I teased her that the costumes didn't change. It was still guys in dresses. But So, I'm glad she's back. But I must say that she really, along with many of her colleagues, was really the inspiration for this book, because I grew up in the 1950s in Washington, seeing all of these very powerful women behind the scenes. And my mother was one. My father, Hale Boggs, was in Congress at the time, and I was privileged to know people like Lady Bird Johnson very well. In fact, I went to the Johnson Library during this book tour earlier in the spring. I teased Mrs. Johnson. I said, you are part of the reason I've done this, but talk about the power behind the throne. Now that the president's tapes have all been released, Johnson's tapes, you can hear the power, and it's quite fabulous. He totally forgot that he had left the tape recorder on, and all the conversations are just fascinating. And I am such a nerd that I listen to them on C-SPAN radio on the weekends. But you'll hear Mrs. Johnson call Lyndon Johnson and say, "Now, dear, I thought your press conference was just fine. I thought you did a very good job. I particularly liked your answer to the question about taxes. Now," and then the critique will come, and you can hear him getting more and more and more defensive. Well, they told me to say that, but so she was one of many inspirations. And as I say, I had seen these women in a significant time in our history after World War II, but nowhere near as significant a time as the period of the revolution and the founding of a new country. And, when you cover Congress and politics as long as I have, you get to a point where you feel quite well acquainted with the Founding Fathers, because, you have to know what they were thinking in debates about things like the right to bear arms or freedom of religion in the press, those kinds of things. And I kept thinking they've got to be very interesting women in this era. And then when Steve and I wrote From This Day Forward, we included a chapter on John and Abigail Adams' marriage. And of course, I realized how incredibly significant she was. What I had not realized, however, was how alone she was, and for how long, and how responsible she was. I mean, she not only had to, of course, raise the children and take care of the old people, but she had to support the family. He was off in Philadelphia thinking great thoughts, and then, in diplomatic missions, and she had to make ends meet and put food on the table, and oh, by the way, the British were coming. And, at one point he wrote to her and said, "If it gets really dangerous, take the children and fly to the woods." Thank you, John. I appreciate that. Hope you're having a nice dinner in Philadelphia. So after I learned about Abigail, I decided that I just absolutely had to learn about the others. And of course, I knew about Martha Washington's winter at Valley Forge, and Dolly Madison saving George Washington's portrait as the British burned Washington. But really, that plus Abigail's Remember the Ladies was about it. And so I embarked on what turned out to be this very arduous but interesting project of learning about them. And of course, as it turns out, Martha Washington's winter at Valley Forge was just one of 8 long winters that she spent during this long war fought in the front yards and backyards of Americans. And I can make the case that she really held the Continental Army together at various times when the soldiers were threatening no bread, no soldier. And they were unfed, unhoused, unclothed, unpaid. And she would arrive from Mount Vernon with great stocks of fabric and food, and she would sew for them with the other generals' wives, and she would cook for them, and she would pray with them, and then there would be great entertainments and try to keep the morale up. And Washington thought it was terribly important for her to come, and begged her to leave behind her duties at Mount Vernon and come every year to keep the soldiers together. But, the first time she came to camp was to come right here, because, of course, Washington, who claimed that he had no interest. The only letter we have of Washington to Martha was the one that he wrote saying he was going to become commander of the Army. And he said, I had no intention of this happening. I'm so sorry. Of course, he went off to the Continental Congress in his military uniform, which was something of a form of lobbying, I suspect. But at any rate, she came here. She was threatened with being kidnapped by the British governor of Virginia, and then there was rumors that she was truly a loyalist. So she decided the smartest thing to do was to come to camp in Cambridge and meet Washington. And it became the first of many, as I say, winters where she was a key. When they came here that first winter, they met a congregant of this church, the Old South Church, Phyllis Wheatley. And many of you in Massachusetts know about Phyllis Wheatley, but most of the world does not. And she was, at that point, though, extremely well known. She was what we would today call an international celebrity, which is quite remarkable. But you know her story. She was a slave girl, and the family that she lived with realized how incredibly smart she was, and they let her stop working, and the whole family combined to educate her. And then she turned out to be a wonderful poet, and she wrote poems that were published in all of the newspapers. And then a book of poems was put together, and it was published here and in England. And in order for the English to believe she had written the poems, all of the leading men of Boston had to write a foreword to validate her. And she then did a book tour of England, in the 1760s. It's quite remarkable, and was known on both sides of the ocean. And so when the Washingtons arrived here, she was invited to dinner, having written a glorious poem about Washington. When they got here, there were lots of other women that they also got to know as they set up housekeeping. And these women were not just patriots, they were uber patriots. These were women who had been explicitly enlisted in the cause of resistance to the British. And that was one of the things that really struck me as I started reading through the documents, was how it wasn't just that the women were good citizens and were helpful. They were politically activated by all of the people agitating against the British taxes and the whole system. And there were handbills tacked up to the trees. There were all kinds of demands that the women resist British goods. And, of course, the main weapon was the boycott, and the women were the people who had to enforce it, since they were the shoppers. And then they then had to replace the goods that were not coming in from Great Britain. So they set up spinning bees up and down the colonies, often in parsons' parlors, and they would spin and gossip and talk politics. And all of their letters are deeply, deeply political. And if somebody seemed to be taking advantage of the boycott to try to jack up prices for the goods that were not boycotted, they were relentless. There was a coffee merchant here in Boston that the women suspected was charging too much because they weren't drinking tea. And Abigail Adams wrote a letter to John saying that a number of females, some say 100, some say more, assembled with a cart and trucks, marched down to the warehouse and demanded the keys, which he refused to deliver, upon which one of them seized him by his neck and tossed him into the cart. He delivered the keys when they tipped up the cart and discharged him, then opened the warehouse, hoisted out the coffee themselves, put it into the trucks, and drove off. It was reported that he had a spanking among them, but this, I believe, was not true. A large concourse of men stood amazed, silent spectators of the whole transaction. Well, of course, these women, also explicitly enlisted other women. And of course, you all know that Sam Adams was here for the famous meeting in December of 1773, which led to the Boston Tea Party. But before that, Adams had, along with his cousin John Adams and with James Warren and James Otis, had conspired around the fireplace of James Warren and Mercy Otis Warren and formed the committees of correspondence there. And Mercy Otis Warren was absolutely smack dab in the middle of it. She became a great propagandist for the Revolution, as influential with the men of Boston as was Tom Paine with the country. And they called on her to use what was the public relations vehicle of the time, which was the pamphlet, and to write these pamphlets spurring on people to resist the British. And John and Abigail Adams both begged her to write a poem about the Boston Tea Party. But it was something that they had been militating for quite a while. In fact, Abigail at one point had gotten snowed in. They lived at that point in what we now call Quincy. It was in Braintree, and Mercy Warren lived in Plymouth. And Abigail had gotten snowed in at her parents' house at Weymouth. And she wrote to John in December of 1773 after this meeting and said, "We have not heard one word respecting the tea." And she was, very frantic that it might just be delivered and nobody would do anything about it. So when the Tea Party happened, there was a great rejoicing, and Mercy's poem was published. I'll read some of it to you. It's not what you'd call a totally accessible work, this 18th century florid work, and which is one of the reasons that she has not really come down in song and story. But she was published, so we have it. The heroes of the Tuscaroo tribe, who scorn alike a fetter or a bribe, in order ranged and waiting freedom's nod to make an offering to the watery god. So praising the men dressed as Indians, obviously. She was never published under her own name until much later in her life, because it would have been unseemly for a woman to do that. But everybody knew who she was, and she became, as I say, quite famous and quite influential. Of course, the punishment for the activities in this church was that when the British occupied Boston, they trashed it, and they set up a writing academy here. But Mercy Warren used that to write, because she was in constant correspondence with the founders in Philadelphia, and she used the activity here as something to spur on the men to get together behind the cause, because not everybody in Philadelphia who was meeting there was sure that resistance was the right thing, and certainly they weren't ready for independence, although these women were talking about independence long before the men were. But they really were. But she wrote to John Adams, and she said, "The desks, the pews, and other encumbrances are taken down in the Old South to make it convenient for the accommodation of General Burgoyne's light horse. I cannot wish to see the sword quietly put up in the scabbard until justice is done in America." They might not have been such good wand members after all. And it worked. He passed the letter around, and it got people agitated on behalf of Massachusetts and helped bring the colonies together. Of course, women were on the front lines, and that was something that was very dangerous and very frightening. Hannah Winthrop, who was also, of course, the wife of a founder, but very good friends with both Mercy Warren and Abigail Adams, wrote to Mercy Warren after Lexington and Concord, and described what had happened. She said they fled from her home, directed to a place about a mile from town, but what a distressed house did we find it, filled with women whose husbands who had gone forth to meet the assailants, 70 or 80 of these, with numberless infant children, weeping and agonizing for the fate of their husbands. In addition to the scene of distress, we were some time in the site of the battle. And then she says, we began our pilgrimage, ultimately walking and riding, the roads filled with frightened women and children, some in carts with their tattered furniture, others on foot fleeing into the woods. But what added greatly to the horrors of the scene was our passing through the bloody field, which was strewn with mangled bodies. So the women were right here, and they were very aware of what the dangers were and what the dangers were to them. In fact, at the Battle of Bunker Hill, John Quincy Adams, who was a little boy, and his mother went up to watch the firing on Charlestown. And, of course, you know the marker is still there at Penn's Hill where they watched from. But many decades later, after he was president, John Quincy Adams wrote about that time. And he said, for the space of 12 months, my mother with her infant children dwelt liable every hour of the day and night to be butchered in cold blood or taken and carried to Boston as hostages by the same hands which on the 17th of June lighted the fires of Charlestown. I saw with my own eyes those fires, and I heard Britannia's thunders in the Battle of Bunker's Hill. Well, that's, of course, when John told her flying to the woods might be a good idea. Still, with it all, they were incredible patriots. Abigail Adams wrote to John at one point, because he was away for years and years and years. She said, you know, we women are the greatest patriots, because we're not going to get anything from this if we succeed. We're not going to hold high office. We're not even going to be able to vote. She had gotten a very rude answer from him when she had written Remember the Ladies. And still we're willing to undergo these hardships because we believe so much in the cause. And as I say, she was left alone for many a year. She was at least, however, in touch most of the time with John. There was another Boston boy for whom you can't really say the same, your very own Benjamin Franklin, who, in this period of the lead up to the war, was often in Britain, representing Pennsylvania, and Deborah Franklin was left doing everything. She had to run the printing business. He was Postmaster General, but he was in England. So she was Postmaster General. And the letters that she writes about the business are quite amusing. But she really did. He was gone for 17 years, and she kept begging him to come home. And at one point, his neighbors felt that he was not sufficiently adamant against the Stamp Act. And a mob rushed her house and was ready to raze it. And she took a gun, Quaker girl that she was, and protected the house and drove off the mob. But he wrote to her and said, well done, Deborah. But still, he didn't come home. And then their only daughter got married. And he wrote her these letters saying, keep the wedding cheap. I mean, some things don't change. And but he wouldn't come home. Finally, she died. And he found himself going home because, as he wrote to a friend, my wife, in whose hands I had left the care of my affairs, died. And so I have to go home. Poor Ben, Now, I'll give him credit. While he was home, he signed the Declaration of Independence. And then he went back to Paris, and and forged the alliance that won the war. But while he was off in Paris, his daughter, Sally, was in Philadelphia, and like all patriots, particularly prominent patriots' families, she was in tremendous danger. And the British occupied Philadelphia. And she wrote to her father and said, "Don't worry, I got all of your papers out, I got all of your books out, and then I took the baby and ran." And she had to move from place to place as a refugee as the British moved in. Finally, the Americans came back into Philadelphia. The British just decided to leave. And they had a big party to celebrate. And she wrote to her father and asked him to send some finery. Now, he was being wined and dined at Versailles, but while she was, escaping the British. And she said, "Could you send me some feathers for my hair, some lace for my sleeves?" And he wrote her back and said, "If you wear your cambric ruffles as I do, and do not mend the holes, they will come in time to be lace." No, you don't like Ben when you're done with this book. He said, "And feathers, my dear girl, can be had from any cock's tail in America." So, I don't know. I ended up not being terribly fond of Ben. But there were brave women up and down the colonies because, of course, the war kept shifting and being fought in the front yards and backyards. In the South, some of them were really remarkable. I think one of the women that I will just never get over getting to know was Eliza Pinckney, who was the mother of two founders. So she's one of the oldest women in the book, along with Deborah Franklin. She, at the age of 16, was left in South Carolina by her father, who was a royal functionary on the island of Antigua. And he left her and her invalid mother and toddler sister, and he left her in charge of 3 plantations at the age of 16. Think how we get nervous about current 16-year-olds behind the wheel of a car. And fortunately, because she had to keep her father apprised of the business, we have her letters, because she formed the habit of copying them into a letter book. And she was just this remarkable girl who kept trying agricultural experiments and doing all kinds of things in the neighborhood, opened a little school and started lawyering for poor people, even though, of course, she wasn't a lawyer. And she kept trying and failing and trying and failing, and then eventually trying and succeeding in the planting of indigo in South Carolina. And, of course, it became the biggest cash crop by far in the period of the lead up to the war, because it was the dye used for all of the military uniforms in Europe. By the time of the war, the British came through. Her house in Charleston was destroyed, as was her plantation. She went to live with her daughter. By then her husband was dead. Both of her sons were held captive. And she was having to try to pull things together, as was her daughter. But one of her sons, Thomas Pinckney's mother-in-law, was really unbelievably incredible patriot. Her house had been taken over by the British, and the Americans came through. General Lee came through and said to her, and Francis Marion, and said, "We hate to ask you this, but the only way we're going to get the British out of here is to burn down your house. And then we can march on to Charleston." And she said, "No problem. In fact, here are some trick arrows that I have that my husband has brought back from the East Indies." Her husband was dead. And she said, once you shoot them, when they land, upon impact, they burst into flame. So she gave them the weapon with which to burn down her house. And a descendant of hers who wrote about it in the 19th century said that the case that the arrows were in had been handed down by the women in the family as a case for knitting needles, which I just loved. I mean, first of all, it was such a swords into plowshares story, but secondly, it was, so practical. But at any rate, they did set the house afire, and the British were smoked out. Fortunately, it wasn't burned to the ground. But then they all sat down to get dinner. The British general, the American general, Mrs. Mott, who was apparently serving them. And General Lee's memoir says, "You would have never known we had just burned down her house." She was delightful. Well, they were, as I say, great, great patriots, with a few exceptions. We can talk later, if you like, about Peggy Arnold. And they suffered through the war, and they really did suffer. And then there was a country to raise. And after the great compromises that produced the Constitution and started the new government, within about 15 minutes, partisanship broke out. And it became very fierce. And it was very dangerous because the country was way too fragile to withstand it, and it was in danger of falling apart. And the women kept trying to make the men behave. Abigail is the exception to this rule. She was just as partisan as they were, if not more so. But Martha Washington and Dolly Madison, who by this time were on different sides of the political fence, were friendly. Dolly's sister was married to George's nephew. And they would make the men come together at the end of a day of cantankerousness in Congress and sit down and have some wine, have some cider, and be civil. But everyone agreed that the only protection for the country to survive would be for George Washington to run for a second term. By the end of the first term, it was the only thing that Hamilton and Madison could agree on, was that Washington had to run for a second term. But he didn't want to do it. He had it. He had been general. He had been head of the Constitutional Convention. He had been president. And he hated the press. We were awful to him. I mean, this notion that this is something new under the sun, that the press attack public figures, even beloved public figures like George Washington, is absurd. He was constantly under attack, and so was his personal life and his family. So he just kept saying, "I'm not going to do it. None of you can make me do it. I'm not going to run for president again." And he didn't really listen to Hamilton and Madison because they had their own interests. They had positions they wanted in the next administration. They were plotting. But there was a woman in Philadelphia who was friends with all of the founders, whom Washington admired very much. She was a great intellect, and he liked her. And he went to tea at her house. Her name was Eliza Powell. Her house is still in Philadelphia. And he went to tea at her house in November of 1792, that late, and still said he would not run for re-election. And so she wrote him a letter that historians agree was probably the thing that tipped the balance. She appealed, of course, to a sense of duty, to a sense of history, to a sense of patriotism. But since it was for a letter from a woman to a man, she also appealed to a sense of pride. And she said, "At this time, you are the only man in America that dares to do right on all public occasions. Your very figure is calculated to inspire respect and confidence in the people." He was a hunk, and he ran again, and the country was saved. And it was saved in large part because of the efforts of the women. And Washington understood that, and he wrote at one point, right after the war was over, he wrote to a woman who was both the wife and mother-in-law of signers of the Declaration. The woman's name was Annis Boudinot Stockton. And she had become the great poet of the Revolution. She was widely published, which, again, was highly unusual at the time. And Washington wrote to her and said, "I think you ladies are among the best patriots America can boast." But the best compliment of all came from the enemy. Lord Cornwallis, before Yorktown, wrote home to his superiors in England and said, "We may destroy all the men in America, and we shall still have all we can do to defeat the women." So these are our founding mothers. They are a great group of women. I know you will enjoy getting to know them as much as I have, and I would be delighted to take your questions. Thank you very much.
That was terrific, Cokie. I have been asked to moderate the question and answer period, and I thought I might start out with one of my own questions, and that is, what are the lessons that you think that women today can learn from your work to be part of making history?
Well, one of the things that I've always felt is that women have a longer sense of perspective. We know that, that babies will be born and people will die and life will go on, and we'll be changing the diapers. And I think that these women give a great sense of that perspective, that even in the midst of dramatic, difficult times, they were always also doing all of the things that they were called upon to do as women, as well as the things that they were called upon to do as patriots.
Great. Good. If people want to come up to the microphone, people who have questions, and while we're waiting for people to come up to ask questions, I was wondering if there is a woman who is either alive or not who you would love to interview.
Oh, there are lots of people I'd love to interview. I'm never good at this, best, worst kind of thing. It's like taking a test. But I'm sure that there are, I'd love to sit down and have a conversation with Abigail Adams, although I'd be a little bit scared of her. But there are a lot of women in this book that I would have loved to have the chance to sit down and talk to. But I've been in the lucky position of interviewing many fascinating women over the years, and what I have learned is that the interview in the shopping mall with the young mom with 3 kids there is often by far the most interesting interview, as opposed to the interview with Golda Meir.
Good. So could you please, as you ask your question, just say who you are?
My name is Peter Golden Cokie. I'm from Natick. I'm a constant reader of your wonderful column.
Thank you.
And a fan of your radio all the time. Marvelous stuff. Cokie, I view the country as an act of creation, not just at the moment of the revolution and thereafter, but throughout our history. And I am intrigued to hear you elucidate the lives of these extraordinary women and the role that they played. New and fascinating stuff. But I wonder if in your reading and your thinking and your talking, you've come across a central figure among all American women. Certainly we'd think of Washington or Lincoln or Roosevelt as central figures in the American epic, who you might characterize as extraordinary and perhaps deserving of the title of the greatest of all American women.
No.
Then perhaps 2 or 3.
But again, as I say, I'm not good at that kind of thing. And that's because there's some people who are wonderful at this and some people who are wonderful at that and some people who are wonderful at another thing. And so I think it's, looking at them as a whole that is what's so interesting. What I could not get over was how deeply political they were and how deeply patriotic they were. And as a group, that really just kept coming through over and over and over again, and I didn't expect that.
Thank you. My name is Phyllis Fanger. Cokie, our book club loved your book.
Thank you.
And my question is, as a political commentator, could you look into your crystal ball and tell us who you think a writer 100 or 2 years from now will look back upon today's world and identify some women of note equal to them?
Oh, I think that you now have a situation where you have women on the Supreme Court and now the first African-American woman as Secretary of State. I think that that will be something that people look back at and are very impressed by. And of course, now we have women in political office in all kinds of positions that are now, and they're powerful women in political office. They're not tokens in political office. And then, of course, there are women in academia and women in the arts and women in sports. I mean, that change is just unbelievable in my lifetime. And the changes in women in science in my lifetime is just unbelievable. I did an interview with a woman who had written a biography of a great female scientist whose name I'm blanking on at the moment. And she was telling me that this woman was not allowed to get her PhD at Johns Hopkins because women were not allowed to get PhDs. And there was a young woman scientist waiting she was going to be the next interview. And she didn't believe it. I mean, it wasn't that, she just thought, oh, that's exaggerated. She literally did not believe the evidence, a scientist, because it was so much out of her frame of reference. So I think that we will look back on this period and see many great women.
My name's Tom Modifar. I'm from Boston Latin School. And I was wondering that in our textbook, they mention a lot of the men, and they give either a whole chapter or half a chapter devoted to them. And after all your research, what woman would you put at least half a chapter in a textbook for?
I'd put them all in the textbook. They, as I say, they were all of these, what they were doing was essential to victory. And the men simply could not have done what they did had the women not done what they did. They couldn't have, they couldn't have just abandoned everything. And in fact, Mercy Otis Warren was incapable of running the business, and James Warren never did become a founder in the way that the two Adamses did, because they would have gone bankrupt. I mean, he played on the stage here in Massachusetts, but he never went to Philadelphia, and she wouldn't let him go. They kept trying desperately to get him to go, and she wouldn't let him go. So it was, the example by bad example in that case. But I think that if you look at the roles that each of them played, and there are many more, but these are the ones whose writings I could find. This was, pulling teeth. You would say that they should be in textbooks, most definitely.
Thank you.
Hi. Thanks for coming to talk about your book today. My name is Sharon Nolan, and I was just wondering if you could give us a brief overview of your research process. It sounds like you use a lot of original documentation in your book. Was it difficult to find material, and did your research process take some surprising paths along the way?
Yes. A good friend of mine who is a teacher by profession and has worked with me on all of my books. But this turned out to be a much, much bigger project than she and I had anticipated. And we started at the Library of Congress and went on from there, but it was very difficult to find the stuff. And I would take books about 18th century life and work from their footnotes and see where things were. Academic text on everyday life of American women in the 18th century, and they would have some references, and then those footnotes would lead me someplace else. But I have to say that with the exception of the Massachusetts Historical Society, which has all of John and Abigail Adams' letters online, which is just heaven, my interaction with historical societies was quite interesting because I'm a daily journalist, and there was a real culture clash. I called one, which will remain nameless, and said, you have the papers of so-and-so. Do you have his wife's papers? Oh, yes. Well, can I get them? Well, they haven't been transcribed. It's been 200 years. Now, it's nothing to them. I'm used to getting the information today, getting it on the air tonight. And so it was quite a culture clash. But we started to find troves. And as you started putting the word out, people started getting in touch with us. And there were some scholars who really got into it. So that right up to the end of publication, I was getting letters, unpublished letters sent to me from a scholar at Columbia that were Sally Jay's letters, John Jay's wife, who turns out to be a fascinating, delightful, somebody you'd love to have dinner with, woman. And as she's sending me these letters, they're tying in with letters of Abigail's, so I'm frantically weaving them back together, as I'm learning about it. So it was just a often serendipitous process, and I'm sure there's a lot more that I've missed. What I do have is a good geographic balance, and I've tried to, sort of bring in different kinds of voices. And I am writing a sequel because this book was getting way too big. And a place that made sense to end it was the election of Adams, because it was now a peaceful transfer of government and the country would go on. But then that doesn't have any of Abigail's quite interesting tenure as First Lady, or Dolly Madison in the war and all that. So I think I have a better sense of where to go to find the stuff for the sequel. Contrary to what you would expect, counterintuitively, the Huntington Library in Pasadena is a great trove of Revolutionary era. And you're saying Pasadena, California? But he just bought up everybody's libraries, and it's really very well done. And the National Endowment for the Humanities I've talked to, and I tried to get them interested in pulling together, because that's the reason we have all these wonderful books about the Founding Fathers, is because 40 years ago they started a project of pulling together all the Founding Fathers papers. And that's why we have all the new biographies of the Founding Fathers, because without a record there is no history. And we need to do the same thing with the women.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here, Cokie. My name is Beverly Droz. I'm a past leader of Women's Action for Nuclear Disarmament and the Massachusetts Women's Political Caucus. I'm looking around the room and seeing a lot of young women and young people here today to hear you and your words of wisdom that you bring us. And we're in Massachusetts, so definitely a liberal state, and you could say that, experience from elsewhere. And I'm wondering about your message to young women today. We find we want to call ourselves patriots because of the work that we do. How do we convince the young women and the young people today that they are patriotic when they serve issues of peace and justice and social activism?
Well, being active in government is a great, huge form of patriotism. Voting is an act of patriotism. And certainly thinking that this country matters enough to be involved is the most patriotic thing you can possibly do.
I'm Elizabeth Good, and I'm from Boston Latin School as well. You talk a lot about the women contacting their husbands and other men involved in the revolution. How did they contact each other and keep their own front moving at home?
They wrote to each other. For instance, Abigail Adams and Mercy Otis Warren and Hannah Winthrop, the three of them wrote. Fortunately, they were just far enough apart that it wasn't easy to visit, so they did write. And then the tone of the letters among the women is different from the letters of the women to the men for the most part, although Abigail Adams is so free with her pen that it's quite wonderful. But their letters combine a lot more of personal life as well as political life, but they all have political tone to them. But that was the main thing. But they also organized among each other. In 1780, before the French arrived, it really looked like we were going to lose. The British were occupying New York, Charleston, Savannah, and the soldiers were threatening at that point desertion by regiment. And a woman in Philadelphia who had been an English woman up until about 5 years before published The Sentiments of an American Woman, which was a broadside published in the Philadelphia newspapers and then published around the country. And she was the wife of the governor of Pennsylvania. Her name was Esther de Burt Reed. And she organized the women of Philadelphia and then wrote to, in what would be a direct mail effort today, prominent women in the other colonies, particularly the other first ladies, and asked them to organize a fundraising drive on behalf of the soldiers. And it was a highly organized, we have all the records of it. The women went door to door where it was appropriate, in Philadelphia, for instance, but organized in the churches in more rural areas. And in the space of a couple of weeks in 1780, they raised $300,000 for the soldiers. And to give you some perspective on that, at the same time the National Bank was being formed, and over a period of months, they had only been able to raise $380,000 for the bank. So there was a very intentional communication among the women and organization among the women. It was political action.
Hi, my name is Lydia Heitman. I'm also from the Boston Latin School. Having researched all the history of the changes that women have made in the past, I was wondering if you believe that there will be any more major women's movements in the future, and how can we achieve that?
Well, I think that that there is sort of an ongoing women's movement, and the women who really carry the water for it are the elected women, who are constantly in both parties, just over and over again, trying to pass legislation that's of benefit to women and children and families. But new issues will crop up, and new problems will emerge on the horizon, and women will be called upon to address them.
And there's also another part of the question. I was wondering if you had any ideas on president, for like a woman as a president. Do you think that'll ever happen?
Yeah, sure. It'll happen someday. I used to think, and I still think the most likely thing is for a woman to be elected vice president and then something to happen to the guy. And, as long as we don't organize to do him in, that's okay. But the truth is we now have a lot of women in place politically who are credible women. And that really wasn't true a few years ago. As absurd as it sounds, women have not had suffrage, only had suffrage for 84 years. My mother, who was in Congress, was born before women had the right to vote. And so we are relatively new to the electoral political scene. But I think that certainly the time will come when a woman will be elected president. It's just finding the right moment, the right woman at the right moment.
Thank you.
I would like to just say that I greatly appreciate, well, first I'm Jimmy Gammage from Marblehead. I greatly appreciate your own appreciation and research on these wonderful women. I think we also have to remember that they owe a debt to the people women who came before them. I've made quite a bit of study on the original
That's great. Did you all hear that? Yeah, I'm not going to do justice, but that the women of Marblehead really kept the town going because the men were off as merchant marine and then as soldiers and as Navy soldiers, and that Washington, out of his own provisions, sent money to the women of Marblehead in gratitude for them keeping the town going. And that story is replicated all over the country. Oh. Yes, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Bora Plaku. I'm also from Boston Latin School. I had no idea that women were so influential. I mean, I always thought that they played a secondary role to the men. But this sort of confuses me because I don't see their voices, or rather, I don't read their voices in the Constitution. What happened to them? What happened to all these patriots? Where were they when, the documents of our country were being drawn up?
Well, I think that part of it was you have to understand the times in which they lived. Married women were not allowed to own property, not even their own jewelry. So that, they were very accustomed to the laws being the way they were. And when Abigail Adams wrote to John and said, remember the ladies and in your new code of laws, it is likely that what she was really meaning was don't have these harsh property rules. But it is unlikely that she was talking about the vote. That was just not something that most people even thought was in the sphere of possibility. There were some exceptions to that. Some widows could vote, and in New Jersey, as a result of the New Jersey Constitution that was written after the Declaration of Independence, they wrote that anyone who was a property owner and was lived in the area, the proper region, and was over 21 could vote. And it was silent on the subject of sex. And then in the election laws that were written to regulate the Constitution, the words he or she were written. And so women did have the right to vote, not married women because they couldn't be property owners and only property owners could vote. But single women and widows could vote in New Jersey, but it was New Jersey, and an election was held, and many women showed up to vote who were not eligible to vote. Now, many more men showed up to vote who were not eligible to vote as well, but the women lost. Their candidate lost, and in 1807, the law was changed to limit the suffrage to free white males over 21 property holders, saying that would be best for the honor of New Jersey. And as you can see, they've had nothing but honorable elections since. It took some evolution. It took some change in the way women saw themselves and saw the role of women in organized society. To change the Constitution.
But such independent women, I mean, you portrayed Abigail Adams as this, powerful figure that, was not afraid to just go in there, and Dolly Madison, I mean, how is it that these women completely lost their voices? How is it that, they became figures right after that?
Well,
that's what I'm not...
I mean, I don't think they did lose their voices with the people that they were with. I mean, I think their voices were very strong among the men. I just don't think that this was on the table for them. Now, Abigail Adams, for instance, did militate vigorously for women's education. And as a result of the revolution, there was a great flowering of women's academies around the country. And some of them did have young women. There's one fabulous speech, the Young Ladies Academy in Philadelphia, where a young woman gets up and says The Senate, she fancied herself an orator, and she says, "Where will I use my talents? The Senate, the clergy, they're all closed to me. By whom? Man, brutal man." And I love this speech because my mental image is she's standing there in some long white dress, and it's a beautiful day, and the rhododendron are all in bloom, and wow, what is she saying? I think that you just have to put yourself in the time and understand where they were. But I don't think that their voices were silent in the time. I think their voices have been silent since because historians haven't written about them.
Hi, my name is Pat Costello. Speaking of the Constitution, what do you see as the prospects for an Equal Rights Amendment?
Basically, zilch, nada. The Equal Rights Amendment was something that was passionately debated, and activists on both sides were very involved for a long time, and then we did get the extension, and it was not ratified. And I think at this point that it's just a dead issue for the time being.
Is that because women are not vocal enough?
No, I think it's because women don't really think it matters to them. And I think that a lot of what it was intended to do has come about through case law, but that still leaves women in a place where they are not a protected class under the Constitution. But the notion that the Constitution leaves women out is, with the exception of the 19th Amendment, is not something that warms the cockles of my heart, to put it mildly. But I just don't think that people think it matters much in their everyday lives anymore.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Cokie, I'm Mark Curley. It's a pleasure to be here with you tonight and hear you. But I also want to say it's equally more of a pleasure for me to be here to have these young students from Boston Latin. These young
I'm
women.
I'm so glad your students were here. Thank you very much for coming. And you didn't even get out of school. I mean, it's one thing in the middle of the day.
I think it's historical because with these young women here, I'm sure just because of your presence and your work, you're going to spark an interest in at least just one of them. And it'll be interesting to see what happens in their lifetime and what they do. But my question is not going to be as intellectual as what they might ask. I have a little bit of a lighter tone to what I'd like to talk to you about. It's a two-part question, if I could. I've been watching this TV series, Desperate Housewives. I love it. I think it's great.
Right.
And
so does most of America.
And I'm thinking that in the pew.
And as a shareholder in Disney stock, I am deeply grateful.
So I'm sitting in the pew here listening, and I've read a lot of history books, but I'm going to read yours to learn about the women. In your research of the letters of the women to their husbands when they're down in Philadelphia, or back to the other women back and forth, and it's my understanding that women talk more than men about their problems. We don't have that capacity that the women do. So did you get anything in their letters that shows some of the problems? I'm sitting here thinking, well, these are all wonderful women and everything's going great except for, well, he's away and we got to run to the woods if necessary. But what's really going on in their marriages?
There was a lot. I mean, Abigail and John Adams, she kept writing to him, furious with him when he was abroad, because he would write her these very stilted letters, and she said, "Have you changed places with some frozen Laplander?" Because he was terrified that his letters would be intercepted by the British and published in newspapers and he'd be ridiculed, because he had letters intercepted when he was in Philadelphia, and they were making fun of some other delegates to the Congress, and mostly John Hancock, And he was afraid of having any of his letters intercepted and published. And she kept saying to him, "How can you do this to me? It's awful for me to be here by myself and having to do everything and then not even have one word of affection from you. That's, asking too much." And there were letters of great sadness among the women when they lost children. I mean, these women were, at the same time that they were having to be so brave, they were pregnant constantly. The men would come home just long enough, and they were losing children, and they were heartbroken about it. And I'm not pretending that their lives were wonderful by any means. Their lives were very, very, very hard, which is what made them such patriots, that they were willing, as Abigail Adams said, to undergo those hardships and still do it for the cause.
And the last part of my question, Cokie, was, did any of them express their feelings on slavery at the time?
Abigail Adams, again, on the subject of slavery, was very adamant. She was a great abolitionist. And I was actually quite surprised to see how many northern families owned slaves. And she, at one point, wrote soon after the war had started, and Norfolk fell to the British. She said, "I have to believe it's because of the sin of slavery that we are losing." So she was quite adamant on the subject. The Southern women who were slave owners do not write on the subject. We don't have any of what they might have been thinking about it. There is evidence of Martha Washington, for instance, being very upset when a slave ran away and not understanding why. So I think that she was probably fairly comfortable with the institution of slavery. But the written documents on it are from the people who were opposed to slavery.
Thank you.
So we'll take two last questions before we wrap up.
Hi, Cokie. My name is Woody Kaplan. I was struck by your comment about these people as being patriots, when in fact, in some funny ways, they were the exact opposite of it. They were rebelling against the constituted authority. And the woman who asked the question about what can we do to bring these women's voices out, dissent is indeed patriotic, sure, and they demonstrated it extraordinarily. I was wondering, the women that were a class repressed, which was why they don't appear anywhere and why you found it so interesting to write about them, what about women that were doubly oppressed? Native American women, women of color, lesbians. Was there any indication of that voice?
Well, certainly we don't have the same writings of them, but here's an interesting thing that just happened historically, which is that pretty much after World War II, American history, until recently with the Founding Fathers Papers Project, really moved away from the great men of history and moved to everyday lives. And so the written work about women of the 18th century is almost entirely about the everyday life of a much less elite woman. A handmaiden's tale, a midwife's tale being a good example. And there's wonderful, wonderful scholarly work about the everyday lives of much poorer, much more oppressed women than these women. What was left out was that after people got away from, historians got away from writing about great men and started writing about ordinary men, they had never written about the great women, with a few exceptions, a few biographies of Abigail. There's one decent biography of Martha Washington, and it's brand new. I mean, it's really something. So the conceit of this book was the women who had the ears of the Founding Fathers. But there are many wonderful books, Mary Beth Norton, Laura Ulrich, Linda Kerber have written wonderful books about the everyday lives of very oppressed women in the 18th century.
My name is Sandra Sandoval. I wanted to ask what your thoughts are on the role of women today. My specific question is, I sense that in our country in particular, we have a very military culture, and in the world, our foreign relationships really, express this. What do you feel is the role of women in tempering this type of mentality? Like, as much as today it seems that the military is almost something that people look at as a necessity and something we have to, focus a lot of our efforts on and pour a lot of funding into. At the same time, I see women as possibly being an alternative voice in this. What is your thought on that?
Well, some women will be and others will not. There are a whole lot of women in the military. And in fact, when I used to do the Sunday show regularly, and every so often we'd get in arguments about whatever the latest scandal was about something going on in the military, the men would, have the highly enlightened view that, gee, if we had just never let women in the first place, everything would be okay. And the fact is that anybody running the modern military would tell you they can't do it without women. So is it true that in general women tend to be more peace voters than men do? Yes. But to imply that women are going to be anti-military in large numbers and men are not, I think is really not a proper reading of the situation.
We're now going to bring Tom Formicola back up.
Well, thank you all for coming. This conversation, I sense, could go on for a lot longer. On behalf of One in the Old South Meeting House, I'd like to thank both Barbara Lee and Cokie Roberts and all of you for